So welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure that we are here today and that we can celebrate Professor David Hopkins' book. Professor Hopkins is from the University of Glasgow, and his new book is called Dark Toys. And my name is Patricia Allmer, and I'm professor of art, modern and contemporary art history at the University of Edinburgh. And it's a real pleasure that you are all here and that we can share this book launch with you. And the structure of today will be, we will have a little conversation, and you will also see a couple of slides and images from the book. So, as I said, it's a great pleasure to be here and to introduce your really important book to our audience online and also here. And this journey really started with your Childish Things exhibition in 2011 here at the Fruit Market. So launching it here is very special.
Yeah, I mean, it's very nice to be able to do that because I need to do it here because we put the exhibition on in 2011.
It's the little box, David, is not turned on in your pockets.
We've lost it.
It's tucked into your waistband, I think. In this one.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's it.
Is that going to be okay? Is that all right? Sorry. Yeah, I mean, it is a great pleasure to be talking about the book in this venue because you did the exhibition. I did the exhibition in the gallery in 2011, and I'm very grateful. I'm still extremely grateful to Fiona and Elizabeth for putting it on, for putting this exhibition on. And it was called Childish Things at that point. And we showed people like Louise Bourgeois, Mike Kelley, Jeff Koons, really significant figures in contemporary art. And it was a very exciting show, but that was really the beginning of the research process in many ways for this book. You know, you sometimes imagine that you're going to put an exhibition on at the end of the research process when everything's all done and dusted. But what's interesting about that exhibition was that it actually ended up as the very final chapter of this book. Okay, but in fact it was the sort of beginning of the research process, and I started then with art of the 1990s, 2000s. You know, these kind of contemporary figures, and what subsequently happened over the next 10 years is that I kind of moved backwards and you know, looked at the surrealist tradition as it sort of led up to those figures. Okay, so I hope you follow that. So that exhibition of 2011 ended ironically being the very last chapter of the book, you know, it was a very exciting exhibition because it opened up the theme of the toy as one which we perhaps should examine, and hadn't really, as far as I was aware, been examined in art history prior to that. One wanted to know really why the toy had been so prominent in art of the 1990s. I think here of Jeff Koons, Mike Kelley, people like that. Why should the child's toys suddenly become so important, so significant? To the extent that with Jeff Koons, actually, the toy is sometimes an enormous thing, you know. So the importance of this very humble object was magnified. It had become almost a symbol of art of the 1990s, particularly in the hands of Jeff Koons. I'm thinking of his balloon dogs, for instance, things like that, you know. So there was an interesting question, you know, why should the toy acquire such prominence? And to investigate that, it was necessary for me, at any rate, to go back and look at the history of surrealism, because that's what I identified as the, if you like, the tradition that had led to this theme of more recent art. Sorry, there's a rambling answer, but that was just talking about the origins of the project, really.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting what you said. That I was thinking about that when I was reading the book, that actually it starts with the exhibition and then becomes a book, and that is going on.
Yeah.
And you can really see in the book as well that this is a good 10 years of research, compiling 10 years of research. So, and dark toys is absolutely fascinating on so many different levels. And these are from the reframing of our understanding of surrealism and its conceptions of childhood, play, and the toy, to the wealth of artists and works. And very importantly, often you are analyzing works which are not that well known by the artists and not that much explored within literature on surrealism. To your discovery of new sources and reference points of artworks. I hope we can discuss that as well briefly, some of these discoveries, because they really are fascinating, and to the intriguing intersections you demonstrate between art history and cultural and popular history. So that is really important in the book as well, and very fascinating how art history and cultural and popular cultural histories intersect and are interwoven with each other. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen very often either in publications on surrealism, that there is this attention to popular culture. I hope we'll have some time to discuss some of these dimensions today, but the book itself is really truly extraordinary, and you need to read it and to have this full experience of its complexity and the many dimensions it has. So I'm going to launch now straight into my questions. And the first one is, what is a surrealist toy? And why did the surrealists make and represent toys to such a wide extent, as you demonstrate in the book?
Okay. What is a surrealist toy? It's not an easy subject. Question in a way, but what I can do is I can answer it a little bit by first of all, kind of showing you some of the images from the book and sort of explaining, going through the structure of the book. And I think that would help to answer what a surrealist toy might look like. But one thing perhaps I should be clear about is that this book isn't necessarily, it isn't about a surrealist making toys as such. It's about the way they were influenced by what I call the culture of childhood to make things of their own. So, I'm interested in the way they take toys, such as maybe a child's rocking horse or whatever it might be, and the way that object then becomes part of their imaginative world, as it were. They do something with it, So in other words, it's not that they're making toys; it's they're using the existing culture of childhood and childish things as starting points for their work, And I should say that actually the book isn't just about toys. Although toys predominate, it's also about children's illustration. I discuss also things like children's entertainments, children's wallpaper even comes in at one point. Any kind of artifact, anything made for children, which can then be presented or used by the surrealists in various ways. So. But I'll just show you, perhaps talk you through some of the examples of things from the book. Here, first of all, the first slide, you have to move the slides on, I think. Is that okay? This is a picture of, this is actually on the cover of the book. I thought it was such a tremendous image of this Max Ernst with Leonora Carrington's rocking horse. At this point, this is 1938. Ernst and Carrington were together in Paris. This is a rocking horse from her childhood, which she actually showed. She actually painted or included in one of her paintings. And it looks like he's in some sort of trance, doesn't it? And he's kind of stepping over the horse into our world or something like that. It's quite a strange, powerful image. Anyway, we used it on the cover of the book just to suggest this kind of interaction between the surrealists and things of childhood in some way. Oh, there's my Dali image, that's good. I'll come back to that in a minute. This is a painting by De Chirico, and you can see very clearly that the subject here is, well, we couldn't exactly identify those toys, I don't think, but they are toy-like objects, obviously. And I think De Chirico is tremendously important as probably one of the very first artists to employ this kind of subject matter, toys and things like that, childish things. This is quite interesting because it's ready-made. Most people wouldn't identify it as such, but it is possibly the first ready-made by Marcel Duchamp. And it is actually a child's toy. It's a bilboquet. It's a French toy, sort of sometimes called cup and ball, where you have to try and, the ball is usually kind of attached to this little spindle thing, and you have to try and get the ball. Yeah. It's very, very difficult. Incredibly difficult, and although it's never regarded, or recently hasn't, up until recently haven't been regarded as a ready-made, I think it could qualify as such. So it's quite interesting that it should be potentially the first ready-made. And early on in the book, I investigate how this image, the bilboquet, metamorphoses, if you like, in surrealist art in various ways. So I think there's a bilboquet lurking in aspects of this sculpture called a suspended ball. I'll actually put that on here, by Giacometti, very, very famous surrealist sculpture, based on some of these sketches I'm showing here. I think, well, I won't go into detail about that, but you'd have to read the book. Yeah.
I'm trying to hold back as well.
Yeah. I'm just trying to give you a sample of some of the images really here. In chapter 2, I go on to questions about illustration, children's illustration, and how that influenced surrealism. In fact, it's clearer probably from these slides. On the extreme left there, we've got an image from Doré, great French illustrator of the 19th century. This is one of his illustrations to Sleeping Beauty. And in fact, both of those are illustrations from Doré. And on the right, or rather, it's the next slide there, we've got a Max Ernst painting called Nymph Echo of 1936, which, this kind of sense of a frozen world almost, as in the famous episode of The Sleeping Beauty, where Princess goes to sleep, and the forest goes around her. You probably know that. I would suggest that, Ernst is harking back to those kinds of precursors in earlier illustration. So I talk quite a lot about that in that chapter. But I also actually talk about the way Max Ernst was interested in Walt Disney. And I rather like this comparison here. On the left, you have a Max Ernst painting. It's called something, is it Human Revolution? 1940s, quite a later Max Ernst picture. And I'm pretty sure that's actually Donald Duck, the head of Donald Duck, distended, kind of distorted in the manner actually of the skull in the foreground of the Holbein painting. It's anamorphosis. I don't know if you agree, I'm pretty sure it is. So Max Ernst using Walt Disney, very interesting, 1940s, what I would call a sort of cartoon modernism. And I think, deliberately using kind of, if you like, aspects of popular culture, things which people might also, at that time, have thought was kitsch, to kind of develop this new vocabulary in his painting. Anyway, I've shown you already that he also drew on 19th century illustrations, and so I've talked about that chapter quickly. The next chapter, talks about Hans Bellmer. I won't talk in great detail about these. I'm just showing some images quickly. Those are actually Hans Bellmer is famous as the most purvey of all the surrealists, you know, for these kind of images, you know, some very disturbing sexual images and so on that he produced later in life. But interestingly, some of his early work is a sort of real nostalgia in his work for childhood and for the things of childhood. And that's what I talk about in the chapter. I decided to not talk about the perverse Bellmer, but in fact the nostalgic Bellmer. And in a strange sort of way, those two things sometimes come together, don't they? You know? So that's Bellmer's collection of childish things, his own toys, which he was presented, his mother presented to them in the 1930s. And they were actually a starting point for a lot of his drawings of that period, which are absolutely amazing drawings, I think. I talk about those in some detail in the book. I can't spend time on them now. So that chapter, the third chapter, I think that was about Bellmer, but I also talk about Cornell there. And I haven't really got a slide of Cornell. I think most people know something about Joseph Cornell, probably. He's normally thought to be the great sort of sentimentalist and romantic of surrealism. I, in fact, decided he was more perverse than Bellmer. So that's a difficult argument to make, but it's an interesting one. Again, you have to buy the book. Okay, we'll move on. The next chapter, I can't talk in detail about it. But the book chronologically now moves from classic surrealism into the 1940s. I talk about surrealism in America and the fascination with childhood in the early 1940s. And that allows me to talk in some depth about Duchamp. And this is an example of the sort of, if you like, the influence of childish things on him. This is his Boîte en Valise. It was a collection of his own earlier works, all of them miniaturized. So that in effect, the Boîte en Valise is it's very much like a child's miniature theatre, you know, which you pull out the scenes and so on. Do you know what I mean? It kind of changes the scenery and so on. And of course, everything is miniaturized. And so I played a lot in that chapter on the idea of miniaturization. And I think that's one of the most important legacies of this interest in childhood, both in surrealist art and art since. You know, the very notion of playing the scale in that way, you know, miniaturization, or of course, in the case of Jeff Koons' gigantism, you know, those tropes, as it were, come out of, you know, well, actually, children's literature mainly, but also illustration as well, and things like that. Okay. So, you know, that's him. I know I'm moving breakneck speed through this, but I'm trying to give you a general idea. I also talk in that chapter about someone who's not very well known in the context of surrealism, who I thought deserved to have much more attention paid to her. This is Helen Levitt, a photographer, who actually did a lot of photographs of children, such as this one of these strangely sort of masked children. And she did these, and I think in the context, well, one can establish she did these in the context of surrealism. And these, in a sense, start a tradition in the history of photography, which is carried through later on to people like Meachard and to Diane Arbus. So that allowed me to bring photography and the whole sort of history of photography into the book as well. And this is just one of her photographs of graffiti. I have a whole section of the book on children's drawings and graffiti and things like that. Again, I can't go into the detail. And so the book then sort of moves chronologically into the 1960s. Well, there were jumps, obviously, but I kind of, the next port of call, if you like, is 1960s and pop art. And then I completely mess up the chronology of the book by starting off with Jeff Koons, because in some ways he is a sort of pop artist, a later pop artist. And I talk about these incredible sort of kitsch sculptures by Koons. I should say this one we had in Childish Things in the exhibition in the Fruit Market in 2011. So we had some really tremendous things, and that was one of them. So I talk about this how surrealism continues into the 1960s, the iconography of the toy being much more blatant now. Now it's much more the commercial toy, you know. So built into the book as well is a history of toys, actually. And I can't possibly sort of unpack all of this now, but the book starts off with things like rocking horses, you know, and bilboquets and so on. But by this point, of course, we're looking at different kinds of toys and different forms of ways of manufacturing them. And that also is part of this history that I'm trying to track through the book. So, you know, there's old Jeff. We all know about him. Perhaps we can come back to him later on. But I also look at Paolozzi, of course, a local hero, if you like. We all know about Paolozzi in Edinburgh, but we don't necessarily know about his own toy collection, which is what I decided to write about in the book. I decided not to do all the usual thing, you know, the usual thing of talking about sculptures and the prints and so on, but to go down to the V&A in London and actually look at his own personal collection of toys. Because Paolozzi collected toys voraciously. You know, he's always buying them. There's a massive collection in the V&A in London, which is not really that well known. It's called the Crazy Cat Archive. And so I went and looked at those and decided to write about Paolozzi from that point of view. And there's some of them, there's some of his toys. And the pop chapter finishes off with Klaus Oldenburg, and fantastic project in my view. What's it called? Sorry, the ray gun wing of his mouse museum. Basically, what he did here, just to be brief, is at a certain point he decided to collect ray guns, and so he started off with the ray gun, which I think was more or less here. Right? I think that's not the one, actually. The starting point, okay. Which ray guns you could buy, obviously, Charles Reagan. It was a ray gun, it's a strange. And then, he kind of decided to collect ray gun type things that looked like ray guns, basically, or all manner of gun. And he sort of eventually just trawled the streets looking for any scrap metal that vaguely corresponded to that, the ray gun shapes. They're still ray guns, he did loads of display cases of so-called ray guns. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. This kind of visual rhyming, if you like, a sort of repetitive, kind of strange practice of collecting these objects. And it seemed to me in the end that these things commented on the American gun obsession, and I talk about that in that chapter as well. Very much examples of dark toys. We haven't talked about that yet, but you can probably realize already or gather that the toys that I'm interested in are very often sinister and dark, as in the title of the book. Anyway, the next chapter is about counterculture, the 1960s. The emphasis is a bit different because here I'm talking about the way the child in 1960s graphics, the work of designers like Martin Sharp for Oz magazine, was also very influenced by surrealism. Okay, and I become more interested in that chapter about the kind of notion of childhood that is developing in the 1960s, the idea of the liberated child. Okay, the child as almost like the embodiment of the surrealist spirit, this kind of thing. And there's actually a cover of Oz magazine designed by Martin Sharp, which makes use of a Max Ernst illustration from La Femme Sans Tête. And I'm probably far too long-winded about this, but this is the last chapter. And right, now we go back in effect to the Childish Things exhibition, which started the whole thing off. This is one of the works we had in that exhibition, which I thought was a fantastic thing. It's very beautiful. It's a work by Louise Bourgeois. It's called Oedipus. Oedipus is a classic surrealist theme, and so it would be perfectly appropriate to read this work in surrealist terms. And of course, these little figurines and things are they're like little toys, are they not? They're toy-like. I won't go into my interpretation of this work. but it starts the final chapter in motion. So, you know, chronologically now I'm up to the 1980s, going to the 1990s, looking also at things like this work by Mike Kelley, which also figured at the Fruit Market in 2011, called Innards. And these are strange things, are they not? They're much darker works, especially the Kelley. And I think they say something about the way childhood itself was being, as it were, reconceived or thought about in this period. And in that final chapter, Dark Toys, which by now the title really hits home, I think, I am talking about issues of, you know, scares, scaremongering, if you like, but moral panics about child abuse and things, issues of that kind. In the 1980s, particularly 1990s, which I do see these artists as responding to in various ways. But again, I won't go into detail. Just a final few images. This is I talked about children's wallpaper earlier on, and these fantastic pieces, I think they're very powerful, by Susan Hiller, are derived. I mean, this is children's wallpaper, effectively, onto which she projected her own kind of script, as it were. This is a sort of automatic writing, if you like, revealing just certain aspects of the wallpaper underneath, as if overlaying onto the child's pre-given kind of imagery, insofar as we create the wallpaper for the children. It's as though she's trying to draw out some kind of hidden messages related within it. That was very interesting. And I finish with in the coda to the book with Wendy McMurdo's work, and it was a great discovery for me later on in the research process to kind of I was aware of Wendy's work, aware of her photography, but I had some great conversations with her, and I realized just how much she was kind of drawing on the sort of tradition that I've been discussing. I mean, she might not entirely agree with me, but I think she did to some extent. And in the coda to the book, I read some of her very recent photographs in terms of the surrealist tradition. And just to give a hint of what might be involved there, I placed one of her photographs here of a child playing presumably with some kind of a digital device or whatever. Except that she's removed it, okay, right? And so I show that next to the Hands Holding the Void, or the Invisible Object by Giacometti. Again, I can't go into the sort of intricacies of that argument, but I think the final argument in the book is that, in a sense, the toy disappears effectively, you know. The kind of grand tradition of a toy, when you wasn't, you know, the rocking horse or the 1960s kind of shiny toy or whatever it might be. By the turn of the millennium, children are using computer devices, you know, they're sort of, you know, the toy in a sense, although it still exists, of course, has far less importance. And somehow Wendy's work addresses that issue. But it seemed to me to be almost there in advance, in some ways, in the work of Giacometti, where you have these sort of ghostly figures, in this case, holding this invisible object, which would actually be a ball, if we, since we know about the background for this object. So, you know, I kind of, in the end, look back to the very beginnings of that tradition through the work of a contemporary artist.
Yeah,
it's a whistle-stop tour, I'm sorry.
Very serious whistle-stop tour.
But I thought it might be useful just for people to see what some of the images were.
But it's so interesting. Again, when I was reading the book, this kind of shift from toy to basically, I had to, because I'm not the youngest anymore, so I was looking at what was the name of this computer game, what you can hold in your hands, and I ended up looking up Toy Boy, which came up with bad things. Eventually, I realized course, it's a Game Boy, isn't it?
Game Boy.
And it is really interesting, this kind of shift from the toy and the manual toy to the game. And the computer game is not a toy anymore, it's a game.
Yes,
And
yes.
it's also interesting how you stay distant from the game. So in the book, the surrealist game is not that much your focus, it's more the toy, isn't it?
That's true, yes, yes. I suppose that changed a little maybe with this at the end.
Yeah.
I think that games are, I do discuss games at various points, but it's mainly the toy,
Yeah.
It's mainly the toy, yeah.
Yeah, and the range of media you are covering is really fascinating as well, really from sculpture, photography, illustrations, paintings. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, film as well.
Film, yeah.
Yeah.
So was that on purpose? Did you or did you set out to cover this kind of range of media?
Yeah, well, I think it's because actually painting doesn't really figure that much in the book. And quite frankly, I find a lot of surrealist painting quite boring, but to be outrageous. I mean, maybe that isn't outrageous, I don't know. But it's very familiar to us all, and I suppose, and sometimes I think its familiarity means that we're not really, it's not really very powerful or potent anymore. And I do think that sculpture, photography, film, a lot of the other media are actually more resonant for us these days, and they are for me, So hence, there's actually not so much concentration on the classic surrealist things like painting here, but there's more concentration on a whole variety of different media, which I think is more arresting for people. But also, I think reflects the fascination with toys and so on. I mean, sculpture obviously lends itself more to responding to toys, than painting perhaps would.
Can we talk a little bit about nostalgia? Because in your book, and of course, since we think about toys, we get nostalgic about our own childhood very quickly. And actually, this is one, again, an aspect of the book where when I read through it, I was reflecting on my own childhood and the toys I was playing with. And then there is also this warning in the book about don't be too nostalgic. There's a sinister side, there's a darker side to it, which I'd like to talk about as well. But note in the book, and I quote you, nostalgia, which is a recurrent theme of this book, is something we need to pay urgent attention to. For good or ill, it is one of the dominant drivers of our cultural mood. So could you talk about this nostalgic dimension of your arguments?
Well, it was one of the most interesting things for me when I wrote the book, and I'm still not sure that I'm fully on top of what I make this, but let me try and talk around this in certain ways. It seemed to me that nostalgia was something art historians never really talked about. It's just like, sentimentality isn't something art historians very often talk about, But it's one of those things which somehow, is sort of slightly embarrassing somehow. So it was interesting to take on a theme which I thought was there in the work, but which really hadn't received any critical or theoretical attention. So, and there is a literature on nostalgia, and a very serious literature on it, and it's quite a, it's a very weighty theme. But this isn't nostalgia necessarily seen as, as synonymous with sentimentality, but nostalgia is seen as a kind of sense of deep loss. I think it's nostalgia is defined by one theorist as a longing for a home one never had. Right? It's there throughout surrealism. There's no doubt about that, but nobody had really looked at it closely before. And of course, that had to dovetail with my own sense of nostalgia. I mean, it's not as though the book is ever about me, but I'm sure I'm lurking there in the background of all that somehow. You can't help it. That has to be the case. And I think I was aware of that, and I was aware also that nostalgia is such a common thing that we all experience. But having said that, I do think that that nostalgia is something which has to be interrogated in a certain way. And when I said that nostalgia is part of our current cultural mood, then I think it is. And you know, I mean, this broadens the whole thing out considerably, because it seems to me that the longing for the past, possibly that we never really had, is, you know, politically something which we're all conscious of these days. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, the world is increasingly difficult for people. The future seems, you know, almost unimaginable. More and more, I think people are looking into the past, whether it's a kind of Tory desire to return to, you know, an England that never probably ever existed anyway, yeah, or whether it's obviously some other form of retreat. I think, you know, that's part of the culture that we're currently living in. Hence, my interest in looking at the way surrealism itself is always looking backwards, it seems to me. One of my central arguments in this book, which I think again goes against the grain of surrealist scholarship, is that I don't think surrealism is a progressive art movement which is driving ahead in terms of the avant-garde and so on. You know, there is a way in which you can see it that way, especially Duchamp. But I think surrealism very often is preoccupied with the past, yeah, and with the spirit of nostalgia. And it's interesting to just examine it in those terms, look at it in those terms. And childhood was, of course, the perfect theme.
Yeah. Then why do you think that the surrealists were rather nostalgic bunch sometimes?
Well, yeah, I mean, they were interested in, of course, in the subconscious and unconscious, weren't they? And you know, that's you know, the child embodies precisely that. And we've all, you know, Freud had to go back into the mind of the child and to sort of find the roots of you know, unconscious obsessions and things like this. And so you know, it was always part of surrealism anyway, you know, this fascination with the child, the sort of the beginnings of the sort of the roots of unconscious desires and unconscious fantasies and so on and so forth. Yeah, so I mean, it's naturally there within surrealism anyway. Yeah.
And, do you think that this notion is connected to romanticism or to romantic notions of childhood?
Absolutely, but one thing that I do in the book, and this is where the dark toys aspect possibly comes in, is that I see surrealism as, you know, very interestingly kind of sort of paradoxical insofar as they keep alive the idea of the romantic view of the child. You think about William Blake, for instance, the great poet, romantic poet, who saw the child as the sort of very symbol of natural goodness and innocence and so on. Yeah, and also, you know, as a sort of a figure of the marvelous, you know, the poetry and so on. But I think the surrealists had that view of the child as linked, as it were, to the you know, foundations of poetry, and the foundations of the marvelous and things like that. But at the same time, the surrealists grew up in the age of Sigmund Freud, and you know, they had to accept, and they did accept, the Freudian view that the child at a very, very early age is sexualized, you know, as a sexual being. And to some extent, that you know, it doesn't sit easily with this more romantic view. Okay, so I think one of the great dramas of surrealism is the way they had to reconcile this vision, the romantic vision of, you know, sources of poetry and the marvelous and so on, with the sense that, with the understanding that human motivation is actually very often darker. You know, yeah. Of course, sexuality isn't necessarily dark in itself, but you know, fantasies arising out of it and so on are things which, well, you know, even now people find problematic and hard, difficult to deal with. But the surrealists wanted to deal with those things head on. Yeah. You know? So there's this paradox. They have to grasp the paradox, and that's why I think, you know, the child is such an interesting image in the surrealist one.
And you insist throughout in the book on the dark, the more sinister side, and of course the title is called Dark Toys. As you state, the process of revisiting childhood toys for the surrealists, and I quote you, could verge on the sentimental, but it was frequently edged by darkness. What is this darker side, and why is it so important? And I was thinking about it actually in terms of the Lacanian mirror stage, where in the moment where you realize that there is a gap in our existence, which is between yourself and the toy you were playing with. So you are one with the toy at one point. Suddenly this separation that creates this kind of gap where the more sinister, darker sides are coming in.
Yeah.
Yeah, my question is, what are these darker sides, and why is it so important for surrealism?
Well, I think actually what you were just saying, I think was very interesting, this idea of applying the Lacanian idea of the mirror stage to the child's relationship to its toy, the sense of some sort of gap.
There's some between once there's a gap between the toy and the child.
Yeah. But I think toys are also, are they not symbols of things that you can't, I mean, very often children, want to have a toy or something, but it never quite lives up to what's expected, as it were. So there's always going to be.
Yeah.
So whether you apply the Lacanian vision image or just this kind of common sense view that we all have, that a child who wants an enormous, great, sort of expensive toy, and once it gets it home, when you can play with it or whatever, we've all experienced that kind of thing. So it suggests anyway that the toy in some way never quite lives up to what's required. So the gap that you talked about is somehow there on the most mundane level or something. But sorry, your question was going much deeper. I don't think I can possibly account for all of the dark aspects of the psyche, of the child's psyche, that I actually touch upon in the book. But let's just think about the savagery of children and the childish imagination, and the things children do, the way they, pull insects to pieces and things like that. Nearly all small children do things like this, investigating things, living things sometimes without any kind of sense of morality, if you like, conventional morality. We would regard it perhaps as quite destructive, savage behavior, and yet the children, of course, it's just a way of discovering, finding out about things. So whether that is actually savage and dark and so on, perhaps another matter, but I think one could talk about the savagery of the childish imagination in these terms. I do actually have a section in the book about Bataille and surrealism. I mean, Bataille, as opposed to André Breton, was very interested as a sort of surrealist sympathizer, let's say, in the sort of destructive impulse in human nature, outside of moral concerns. And I talk about the Bataillean child, if you like, in one section of the book.
Fascinating discussion. So which one of the works in your discussions is the most sinister one? What did you say?
That's a bit difficult, that. I would go probably for, of the ones I've shown you here,
Wow.
I think Innards is pretty sinister, possibly. Mike Kelly's sinister. I think this, as I said, we have this, actually, it's great to have it here in this gallery, the Fruitman Kit, in 2011, look at it more closely. But what it consists of then is a sort of blanket, presumably a child's blanket, or some, child's blanket, with these sort of knitted forms which seem to have been sort of wrenched apart. It's like some sort of, possibly a toy, a soft toy, or which has been sort of pulled to pieces. An example of this childish ferocity, which I talked about a minute ago. Now, I've got a feeling that these works by Kelley allude to forms of child analysis, probably Kleinian analysis, where an analyst will get a child to act out certain kind of fantasies and things, and usually in front of the analyst, as it were. And there was something of an obsession in America in that period with that kind of analysis. And I think it's a sort of parody almost of that sort of child analysis, really. But it's a very dark work, isn't it? It's quite sinister.
So another area which scholarship in surrealism doesn't very often touch on is kitsch. So, and it is extraordinary how much kitsch there is in surrealism. And also the artists you are including, like Jeff Koons, for example, I mean, he loves kitsch and he plays with kitsch in all sorts of ways. So could you talk a little bit more about kitsch and the significance of it?
I was going to read one little bit from the book. Shall I do that?
Yes.
Will there be time?
We
Yeah.
don't
Want to go on endlessly.
No, we've got time.
I don't know if that's Fiona's nodding. I don't know if this is good or a bad thing. Just to respond to what you're saying, I'll read this time just this little bit. This is, I think, I'm only going to read one little bit from the book today, and but just to give you a little bit of a flavour of the writing. I thought, this is quite interesting. This is a illustration by Salvador Dali from The Secret Life of Salvador Dali, which was published in 1942, which is a book all about his own childhood reminiscences. So I took, for Dali, rather than take all of his very famous paintings, things like this, I just took this one incidental little image, and I wrote a little bit about this here. And I think this touches on the whole business of kitsch. So I'm going to take about 5 minutes over this. That's all right. Are you sitting comfortably? Reviewing Salvador Dali's autobiography, The Secret Life of Salvador Dali, in 1944, George Orwell raised an issue that has since been under-researched in the vast literature on surrealism, its affinities with children's book illustration. Orwell had little sympathy for Dali. From a socio-political perspective, Dali, he asserted, was, quote, as antisocial as a flea. Finding the artist's florid childhood memories and obsessions little more than the symptoms of a diseased intelligence, he nevertheless attempted a fair-minded appraisal of the book as a record of fantasy, as a record, quote, of fantasy, of the perversions of instinct that have been made possible by the machine age, unquote. Commenting on the virtuoso ink drawings that punctuated the text, he made a shrewd visual point that deserves quoting at length. This is George Orwell. The most persistent strain is the Edwardian one. When I opened this book for the first time and looked at its innumerable marginal illustrations, I was haunted by a resemblance which I could not immediately pin down. I fetched up at the ornamental candlestick at the beginning of part 1, and here it is. What did this thing remind me of? Finally, I tracked it down. It reminded me of a large, vulgar, expensively got-up edition of Anatole France, which must have been published about 1913. That had ornamental chapter headings and tailpieces after this style. Dali's candlestick displays at one end a curly fish-like creature that looks curiously familiar. It seems to be based on the conventional dolphin. And at the other is the burning candle. This candle, which recurs in one picture after another, is a very old friend. You will find it with the same picturesque gouts of wax arranged on its sides in those phony electric lights done up as candlesticks, which are popular in sham Tudor country hotels. There's a put down. Now, I do actually talk about candlesticks later in the chapter because I think you can find exactly the same candlesticks in one of the scenes from La Belle et la Bête, Beauty and the Beast by Cocteau film, which is a wonderful film. But he also uses those kitsch candlesticks. Anyway, suffice it to say that what Orwell had in mind were a couple of headpieces at the beginning of Anatole France's Turgid, The Gods Are Thirsty, translated into English in 1913. Overly embellished and vaguely Art Nouveau in style, they do indeed have a broad visual correspondence to Dali. Orwell's main point in showing how Dali harked back to such visual models was to establish that a certain conventionality underpinned the artist's extravagances, which went hand in hand for him with moral cowardice. But Orwell does touch on an important aspect of Dali's aesthetics. As is well known, Dali had promoted the organic stylizations of Art Nouveau in works such as The Invisible Man of 1929-33. The invocation of Art Nouveau was aligned for Dali with his anti-modernism, a strategic return to the ornamental excesses of bourgeois turn-of-the-century taste, in repudiation of the aesthetic protocols post-Cubist art. He would come to define his painting precisely as instantaneous photography done by hand of the superplastic images of concrete irrationality. The formulation that neatly summarizes the datedness inherent to his aesthetic while hinting at the lurid Disney-like appearance of his works. So in other words, in kitsch, I won't actually, I was going to read more, but I don't think I will. I've just sort of established that kitsch was absolutely central to what Dali was all about.
Yeah.
People tend not to understand the work in those terms. We're not most to think, supposed to say, we all admire, people always admire Dali's technique, but in fact his works are supposed to sort of be actually quite lurid, They're quite, there's anti-aesthetic in many ways. And they borrow heavily on, they rely heavily on Disney. Yeah. To the extent that Dali nearly collaborated with Disney on one of his films. So that kitsch is actually right in the center, heart of surrealism in lots of ways.
It's also interesting our relationship to kitsch. As soon as you say, "Oh, this is kitsch," it's something derogative rather than.
No, it's not. This is.
So
the surrealists love kitsch. They love.
Yeah, exactly. But that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Perhaps that is a reason why people take a distance from the word when they talk about surrealist art. But as you say, there's a lot of kitsch in surrealism.
Yeah.
I'm going on record here. Dali is very kitschy.
Yeah.
But we need to start thinking about it in terms of in critical terms.
We need to look at it analytically, I think.
And analytically, yeah.
Again, just as nostalgia was one of my themes, and that's just a bit embarrassing. So is kitsch,
Exactly.
which is often regarded as sort of,
yeah.
So I wanted to look at these things head on, actually read surrealism in those terms.
Yeah. So another really important aspect of your book is this threading together and the bringing together of art historical and also cultural historical explorations of childhood toys, and showing how the development of surrealism and its relations to toys is entangled with the cultural development of childhood play and toys. So I found it really fascinating how we basically read the development of toys and childhood through surrealism and vice versa. Can you talk about the importance of and the ways in which these art histories and cultural histories intersect in your book? And also, when did you realize that this project was about unraveling and exploring a cultural history through art?
Yeah, well, I think that when I did the exhibition, to go back to that, in 2011, looking at these amazing works by Mike Kelley and Susan Hiller, we had a fantastic installation at that show called An Entertainment, which I actually discuss in the book at some length. Which seems, it's about Punch and Judy. This big installation by Susan Hiller has images from sort of Punch and Judy shows. It's a sort of fragments of film, of Punch and Judy shows, and one's aware of the kind of violence of the Punch and Judy show. That we might think of it as something that's going to be amusing. It's part of it's a so-called entertainment, children's entertainment, as she referred to in the title. But of course, in fact, the Punch and Judy show is punctuated by Punch clobbering the, Judy or else a child or whatever. So it's a very violent thing, and that's what Helen was bringing out in that very powerful work. Now, in looking at something like that, of course, I had to ask myself, well, what does this say about current attitudes to childhood? And that's where, some really dark aspects of the book came into play, because the project came into play, because I realized that An Entertainment was very much a response to child abuse issues. The period in which it was created. I won't go into detail about this, but it even seemed to me in the end that the satanic aspects of it, because actually Punch and Judy in its traditional forms has got quite almost satanic elements. Death actually appears in the traditional Punch and Judy and so on and so forth. But these seem also to be linked to this kind of massive sort of moral panic about Satanism and so on, and satanic abuse of children. That was current in the press in Britain precisely at the time the work was made. So in other words, I found that the only way of really talking about this was to map onto the work a kind of cultural history, if you like, of childhood. And I ended up doing that in fact throughout the entire book. So I actually developed an account of the surrealist interest in things of childhood in tandem with an account of the way childhood itself was understood and construed in these various periods. Now, of course, I can't go into detail about that really.
Yes, so it's really fascinating. Can I just ask in terms of time, because I think we should leave some time for questions as well.
We're about half past 7 now, so maybe 15 minutes of questions. And then I think the publisher had given us a glass of wine as well.
Wow.
If anyone would like
That's
that.
quite something.
Okay, so perhaps if I have one or two more questions
Yeah, go on.
towards you,
Please.
because again, it's there are so many aspects.
They're great questions, incidentally. They really make me think.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus. It's good though. It's good. Yeah.
So one of many examples of the rereadings you are presenting in your chapters is the breadth and depth of contexture in which you resituate Max Ernst's work. And it's really interesting how you resituate Max Ernst in relation to Germanophone and Germanic traditions and literary traditions, and specifically in relation to Wilhelm Busch, who is a very famous illustrator and humorist and poet. And if you grew up in Germany or in Austria, then you would know his Max and Moritz narratives very well. Yeah. And you really identify these narratives as part of Ernst's work. I think you, and it ranges from Wilhelm Busch and the specificity of the Germanophone culture to Walt Disney and that kind of American pop culture.
Yeah.
So you're doing here a really interesting double move, showing that his own Max Ernst's childhood was a crucial reference point for him, which in my work on René Magritte, the childhood is also a crucial reference point for Magritte. Yeah. But also that we have to pay attention to this Germanophone and the specificity and the national specificity.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid I haven't got any images of Busch. It would have been nice to look at those, but that's one thing that you can find in the book. But nobody had really talked about Busch in relation to Ernst, which is pretty amazing, because all German children grow up, I think you've alluded to this, with Maxim Moritz and so on, So, and when you actually look at those illustrations, I try to link those to some of Ernst's early surrealist drawings. They're just really drawings of around 1922 or 3 or something. So I was making these links then to Ernst's childhood in Germany. Yeah. And a lot of the literature on Ernst tends to look at the French background. Yeah. Which is a bit silly, really, isn't it, if you think about it? But there has been that tendency, and apart from some of the earlier work on Max Ernst, which is authored by German art historians, the tendency has always been to look at the French background. So I was just trying to correct that and do something a bit different.
No, it's really interesting.
We talked about Disney before, so I don't think we need to go on about that. But I'm fascinated by the way that Ernst. I've talked about how Dali made use of Disney, but this, of course, is how Max Ernst actually, I think, makes use of Disney during the 1940s. And just to elaborate that slightly, it seems to me that they were using kitsch, the Surrealists were using kitsch at this time precisely to have a go at Clement Greenberg, the great sort of writer about modernism, who at precisely that time was saying that Surrealism was not being part of the modernist tradition, it was effectively kitsch. And Greenberg was saying that anyway. And so I think they give Greenberg a whole dose of kitsch,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah, so as a kind of one of my final questions, so I found it really interesting how you focus on Paolozzi's personal collection rather than his sculptures or his prints. And then I was thinking about your own personal dimension in this research. So did you see your own childhood shimmering through the research at some points, or were you influenced by your own experience, or it also coincides with your child growing up?
Yeah, I mean,
with the writing of the book.
I like the shimmering idea. Yeah, I'm sure it did. You know, I haven't really thought about this in great depth. But I do know that surrealism, this is to make a slightly broader point, I guess, that what interests me about surrealism, and I say it in the book really, is that it's been seen as by certain people as, and I think this is correct, as concerned with re-enchantment, with the re-enchantment of the world. The sociologist Max Weber in the early 20th century said that one of the characteristics of modern man, and woman, of course, was that we had lost that through bureaucratization of life and through technology, that the modern world was disenchanted. He talks about that kind of disenchantment, and I think we could say that historically, you know, surrealism and art movement was concerned with a kind of process of re-enchantment, a re-enchantment of the world. And this is rather a beautiful aspect of the movement, I think. And I think for me, you know, when I got into surrealism, and it was quite early on, when I was growing up, as it were, yeah, I'm sure I saw that in it, you know. So I'm not really talking about any childish memories here, but I'm just talking about that kind of sense that one was drawn to surrealism because it was precisely, you know, the world of enchantment one had, maybe as a child at certain points, you know, playing with some toys or whatever it was, or looking into a picture book. The surrealism seemed to return you to that state. Yeah. And I still think that that's really what's most significant about it.
Well, strangely for me, surrealism itself is part of my childhood because I saw at the age of 12 the René Magritte picture and it changed my life. And, but it was part of my childhood memory.
Yes.
So my final question, so after all this reading and research and study of artworks and objects, what is your favorite surrealist toy?
My favorite, I do know about some of your questions. I have to say that this may seem to be spontaneous, but I'm aware, but you've got another question as well, which you must ask me after this. But anyway, but full stage man, it's really is. But it's not. It's a lot of this is spontaneous. But yeah, my favourite surrealist toy. I don't know. But I think that I'm rather partial to the. If I had to own one of these things, right, I would go for that. Oh no, it's gone. Where is it? Oh, there it is. That's the one I would love to have. But it's not so toy-like, is it really? But I think it's just an amazing thing. I'm very partial to this idea of the process of miniaturization. You know. And I think Duchamp, you know, does it in a rather special way here. And he makes all of his previous works into little toys that you could pick up and play around with. And given that some of these things are mighty gestures in the history of art, ready-mades and so on, it's wonderful that Duchamp could just turn his own past oeuvre into things which you could just kind of, you know, play around with in the way that you would with toys. And for me, that's very poignant. Yeah.
What's the last question? You really do want that?
Yeah, I do. I want it.
So, are there any surrealist toys on the market at the moment, or toys at the market, which you would recommend us to buy for ourselves? Aha, that's right. You wanted the last question. for ourselves or for our children? Is there
Well,
anything-
a couple of Christmases ago, a couple of friends of mine, sitting there in the audience, bought my son, right, this thing, right? I'm going to show you in a second. And of course, being 17 years old at the time, he didn't seem very interested. It's sad, you know, it's really sad. He didn't go for it. But I could see the potential in this straight away. I think this is really rather good. Now, I know that I'm doing a piece of advertising here, possibly, but I don't know if that matters very much, is it really? I doubt whether it's still on the market, but it's actually rather good. This is it. Can you see it? It's a notebook. Harry Potter notebook. Looks like some squashed creature. There's 4 eyes, right? Can you see that on the top? It's all this fake fur, 4 eyes there. Are they there? Oh, they are there. Just about. And there's its jaws. I think that's fantastic. I mean, it's merit Oppenheim, you know, or whatever. So there's my, you know, that was a difficult question.
Yeah.
I have to say, I knew about this in advance. I've had 2
You
days.
researched it, yeah.
And I thought, oh, yeah, I've got it anyway. I've got it perfect. So that's thanks to Alison Cathy.
Well, thank you so much, David, and congratulations again to a really magnificent volume. Please do go buy it. It's a fantastic book.
Right.
And I think we now
Thank
have
you.
time for questions.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. The first applause. So I think we have a couple of minutes for questions.
Anybody dares.
You talked about the disappearing, like the physical toy. Sorry, speak louder.
Yeah, if you could.
You talked about the disappearing of like the physical toy in place of like technology. Do you think that has something to do with like the linking of like the commercialization and the rise of like we're talking about the part and multiples of like the commercialization of toys in the sense that like things became franchises with like regular around advertising to children? I was wondering if there was links there.
I'm sure, yes, absolutely. The question was, so you're saying that, you know, is the disappearance of the toy, or part and parcel of this process of, you know, commercialization and
Yeah, I was thinking,
franchising?
is there like a lack of like free play, like when toys which like children supposed to be showing us earlier in the presentation with Duchamp, that they're very abstract objects. There's space for free play and the objects like I don't know, things to be made with it, whereas like if it's a series or big commercialized, it's like made up for already. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's a very interesting question. I think that runs right through the book, really, that back of what I'm saying. There was one theorist of childhood and toys and so on in the 1990s called, I think, Postman, Neil Postman, who talked about this notion of the disappearance of toys. I talk about him in the book. And he said that basically, that had been lost. You know, the kind of closeness of the child and the sort of element of imagination involved in playing with the toy and so on that we think about in relation to, you know, kind of, I don't know, rocking horses and things like that. Yeah, that in a way that had progressively got lost, as it were, in the course of the 20th century, partly through these processes, commodification, commercialization, and so on. And you know, he's deeply pessimistic about that. You know, you just see it's a massive loss. And I suppose in the end, I sort of wanted about that. You know, I sort of have a sense of poignancy, a sense of loss, because you know that kind of closeness with a toy, which is a physical thing. You know, a grasping of the object, moving the object, and so on, which actually you find in the surrealist objects as well. You find it in Duchamp, for instance. I don't know if people know Duchamp's ready-mades, right? There's one of them which is called With Hidden Noise. And it's basically With Hidden Noise consists of some string, what do you say, a ball of string, a spool, whatever you call it, ball of string, with an object that's been placed in the kind of center, where there's a gap, you know, things around. And then he clamps two place to that, right? But you were meant, because of the size of that object, in theory, you would kind of move it and you would shake it because you want to find out what's inside, yeah? So it's like a toy, it's toy-like. Okay, that was once the nature of toys, was it not? You know, that children could grasp them and play with them and so on, and they would enter into kind of imaginative rapport with the object and so on, yeah. And possibly this has been lost. And we're now into some other sphere, right, of experience. It may not be negative what we currently have, you know, but it certainly is different in kind, isn't it? And yeah, I mean, that's one of the themes of the book, to try and track this shift of, you know, experience, you know, child's experience. Talk about how that is registered in surrealism and post-surrealism. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Speak louder.
What would you think is going to be like a good
book? What made me think it was going to be a good book? How did I decide it was going to be a good book?
Yeah, how to write it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I just love this project. I always did. I've written about other things. I've written about masculinity, and I've written about you know, Duchamp, and Marcel, and surrealism in terms of occultism, and alchemy, and things like that. But this topic has engaged me much more than those other ones, and I'm actually rather pleased to have written this, you know, because I enjoyed it enormously, and I think it was really, I discovered something that was very close to me, which probably goes back to those things I talked about the idea of enchantment, you know. Yeah, so I enjoyed it, and does that answer your question? Oh, good. I'm glad I answered your question.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Yeah, I'm just wondering why dark toys, and is there another book about a lighter side?
Oh, no, there aren't any light toys at all. They're all dark. Didn't I talk about this sort of sinister side of these things? Yeah. I don't know. Of course, I chose dark toys because it had a certain resonance. About, you know, I mean, people, I suppose, imagine toys on the whole to be innocent things and so on, but the surrealists very rarely make toys into innocent things. They always give them this kind of edge, to see which I've been talking about. So that was my subject there. You know. And I think if it had just been about innocent toys, it would be as boring as anything. You know? No.
I think the night is interesting as well. Toys at night, and when you're in your bedroom and suddenly they start to shine or glow or something like that. And
Animism, yeah. The idea of toys coming to life,
yeah,
which is a classic motif in literature, which I do talk about as well. I haven't talked about it yet. You know, that's in the book as well. You know, there's this fantastic vein of literature. You know, the Nutcracker, Hoffman. That's also, isn't that pretty dark, isn't it? Yeah, that's not innocent stuff, is it? You know, toys coming to, you know, dancing around. I would find it pretty weird. So I don't believe in innocent toys. I think all toys are real dark, right? That's my title.
Thank you. Are there any more questions?
Yeah.
Sorry. I wanted to ask you about duplicity.
Duplicity.
Duplicity and lying.
Wow.
Because you quoted Dali, and obviously The Secret Life is a duplicitous autobiography. It's not, he makes no claim to be telling the truth. And you've been talking just now about making no claim to be being spontaneous either. So I'm interested in the closeness of imagination and simplicity, basically. And this notion of dark toys and the dark imagination, and I agree with you, the surrealists, I think, it's a long time. So I studied surrealism, but largely thanks to you and your fantastic exhibitions, I think about them a lot. Obviously their relationship to enchantment is interesting, but surely they also have a relationship to duplicity and deliberate deception. And I'm sorry I haven't read the book, but I am going to say it's on sale this evening at a special price. So we can all buy it here. We don't need to go anywhere and buy it here. Can you touch on that? This notion of truth and lies.
Well, I wish I had.
Next book, there you go, it doesn't have to get out.
Yeah, I think it's implicit in quite a lot of it, but I haven't drawn it out in the way that you just have. Yeah, oh God.
Sorry.
No, you've allowed me with a difficult one there, Phil. You know. Surrealism never really talks to you in a kind of straight, direct way. You know, it's always talking through allegory or images, other images, popular images, through, as I say, old illustrations, children's toys. It's always got these kind of mediating things. You know what I mean? It's never talking to you straight. So, you know, how, you know, the whole notion of duplicity must to some extent be inbuilt, I think, in a way, you know. That's a complex question, and I can't produce a wonderful answer to that one. But it's an interesting thought, thank you.
I think it's also surrealism has these figures like the jester or the magician, which is exactly that a pretense, but actually it's just a trick. So that's interesting as well in terms of simplicity.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, there was a question here.
Congratulations on the book.
Thanks.
I think the idea of enchantment is very important. And just elaborate, perhaps on mentioning the primitive, that there is this universal, almost universal interest in the primitive, in the early decades of the 20th century. And the reason I think like the child was so fascinating was because that, unlike modern men, the child was primitive in the sense of spontaneous, conceptual, natural.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, questions about, you know, the kind of childish sort of cult of primitivism in the early 20th century. And actually, again, it's something we haven't touched upon in the discussion, but it is in the book actually, that because of the construction of the child as other, you know, as almost kind of alien, is actually really very, very important in surrealism as well. That the child actually could represent some kind of absolute otherness to the adult, okay? And in that sense, I think sometimes the child is placed on a par with the so-called primitive other, okay, in surrealism. You know? And you have, you know, kind of demonic sort of images of children and so on in surrealism. Again, they're very dark. You know? Yeah. I can't really go into that fully, but I think it's fascinating and very important part of surrealist construction of children and childhood.
Thank you very much. I think we wrap it up and try the wine. That's a good plan.
About time, I think. Yep.
Congratulations again, David.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I'll be very happy to sign. If anybody wants a signature.
Well.
Yeah.